What's up, guys? Welcome back to the channel. We're going to take a look at Ghost of Tsushima here on the ROG Ally, Legion Go, and the MSI Claw. I thought this would be a fairly interesting comparison. So this is a little different from what I would normally do. We're not going to get into a lot of recommended settings. I'm really going to narrow the focus down to medium settings, a couple different wattage options, and some stuff for the Claw, FSR, and all that. And we'll just take a look at what performance is looking like for all these devices right now in the first 7 or 8 hours of me getting into this game and playing it. Now, there are a lot of options, though, when you get into this game. It's very graphically intensive, and it helps when you use FSR. The more you bump that up from quality to balance to performance, you're going to get a little bit more FPS out of it. Of course, you're going to have differences with your visual quality. And of course, besides FSR, we can also pull a lot out of the game when it comes to the settings. Now, this comparison will mostly just set with the medium preset with motion blur and vignette turned off. But there are real-time graphic settings you can change, low, very low, medium, high, and all that. So if you find yourself, especially later on in the game in maybe more intensive areas where medium's not working out, you can certainly start to bring things down and get better performance. And in areas that aren't so rough, you could bring that up if you want the visual fidelity. So with that kind of thing happening with this, and this being a pretty solid PC port, it works out well, and you can adjust these settings how you want to play the game on whatever device you may be playing it on there. Also, besides that, we're going to be at 20 watts and 30 watts, and there's not a huge difference between the 20, 25, and 30. I use 20 a lot in handheld mode, that's why I picked that, and unplugged for the Claw, unplugged in for the Claw, and then 30 watts for the devices. So let's go ahead and get into it and take a look at some of the comparison here. So here's our 1080p medium, FSR balanced 20 watts, 4 gigs of VRAM for the ROG Ally and Legion Go, 1080p medium XeSS balanced, unplugged auto VRAM for the MSI Claw. You can see it struggling there in this scene in the beginning, and you'll see that across some other areas here as well. That's the best I can do. We can't really bring the Claw down in performance more because it's really going to gimp it. We either need to do unplugged or plugged in because there's a dramatic difference there when it comes to that. So we're just going to go with that here for what we got, and then we'll match our wattage on the other devices. But as you can see here, running these settings, the Ally and the Go perform very similarly. There are areas where the Go, maybe because of the RAM and this being graphic intensive, is getting a little bit more on the FPS side over the Ally, but frame times often are very, very similar when it comes to those two, and I would expect that with the same Z1 Extreme. The MSI Claw, however, even here, especially with the unplugged performance up against the 20 watts of the AMD, it really does struggle in this game. And this is all with updated drivers for all these devices, even for Intel Arc here with the update for this game. It's just, this device really does struggle with its power balance, and especially unplugged, even having enough power to run very well. And you can just see that across the board here up against the other devices. But the ROG Ally, the Legion Go running very similar to each other here. Sometimes the Ally will take the lead, sometimes the Go will. It really depends on the scene and what's going on. But ultimately they seem to run very, very similar. And that's with the Go being on older drivers as well. We're still waiting on newer drivers, so I don't have anything sideloaded. We're still on the official December update there, but we're on the newest Ally update that they released recently here as well. So yeah, you can definitely see the major difference here in these. I think these comparisons are a lot of fun. It's hard to really put them all on exact level playing fields, but I did my best to kind of do a decent job here and get them similar so that we could figure out what we had. XeSS just runs a lot better on Arc, and that's the way you should really go over FSR, so I really wanted to use that with balance up against the FSR here as well when it comes to the Claw versus the other two. I used a lot of various scenes across the game, just kind of getting a general idea of what performance would be like, at least in this first larger map area in the first 8 hours or so here, and it worked out pretty well. I wish we could see better performance from the MSI Claw overall, especially unplugged. Hopefully they're going to continue working on this, but so far the game for me is running great on the Ally and the Go. Now let's take a look at higher level performance here at 30 watts, sticking with all the other same settings for these, and plugged in for the MSI Claw, giving it even more performance. This is where it performs its best, really, but it still can't keep up or get up to what the Z1 Extreme is doing in the ROG Ally or the Legion Go here. And again, the Go and the Ally run very similar. However, there are some areas of the game where I did notice more gain from that 30 watts over 20 than the Ally would get from 30 watts over 20. Not all the time, not necessarily consistently, but I did notice that kind of throughout the game there. So something there with the Legion Go sometimes getting more there. The Claw certainly suffering, still not able to climb up to that GPU usage or performance of the other two devices, unfortunately. Now, there are some skips and stutters around busier NPC areas like the Golden Temple for all of the devices, but I felt like overall the ROG Ally and the Legion Go at 30 watts here did a great job, and they perform very similarly here in these few scenes without much of a difference, with the Claw doing its best to try to stay there up above 30 and into the mid 30s with some fairly rough feeling gameplay and frame time for me. Definitely the game doesn't feel great on the Claw. Maybe if we locked it to 30 it would help, but it still suffers quite a bit. And that auto VRAM really isn't helping us. I wish we would get an update to be able to lock that down. But yeah, I thought this was pretty interesting performance for 30 watts, kind of maxing out those other couple of devices and plugged in performance mode, maxing out the MSI Claw and seeing what they could do here up against each other with the same medium settings and running everything here. Now, the other thing I did want to take a look at with these comparisons is frame generation for all of the devices. So I switched XeSS balance to FSR 3 balance for the Claw because it's the only way I could get frame gen to really work properly without a lot of problems. And yeah, ultimately for the most part it works pretty well here for all three devices. Now the thing is about frame gen and FSR being kicked in, there's definitely more ghosting and artifacting and loss in visual quality. Some people are going to care about that on the smaller screen and some people are. It is pretty smooth though, and I did really enjoy a lot of the frame gen stuff. It's working pretty well in this game with the in-game frame gen. On the Claw it's a little rough. You do get the increase in performance and more GPU usage, so it's definitely better than without, but it still suffers quite a bit. But yeah, frame gen is there, it works decent in this game, and if you can deal with the added input latency and some of the ghosting and artifacting that come with it, it can, for the eyes, create a smoother experience when it comes to the overall FPS. So frame gen, I think, is implemented pretty well in this game, and considering the Legion Go is still waiting for new like frame gen drivers and stuff, Ally has gotten its driver level ones recently, I think it's handling this pretty well. It's also fairly impressive that we can do this at around 20 watts, and even unplugged on the MSI Claw, it fares pretty well with FSR and frame generation being on. But yeah, overall, being 20 watts in handheld mode, I think that's pretty solid if you're willing to try that out and give frame gen a go over maybe lower FPS without it. Now you can lower the settings down to something like low if you want to, tweak some of those, and you can actually get back up into the 50s without frame generation, and lower settings even higher. So if you don't want to go that route, you can definitely lower settings to get there, and that'll work out for you. All right, so let's take a look at all three devices compared to themselves. So starting with the ROG Ally. We've got our 20 watts to our 30 watts to our 20 watts with frame generation here, and you can really see the difference. Now, of course, we don't get a huge gain with the 30 watts over 20, depending on how intensive of an area it is, but you will notice it does help with the frame times, which of course makes the game feel better. So if you're docked, of course, that would feel better. 25 watts might help a little bit in handheld mode, but still 20 watts is a great sweet spot that I use a ton on all of my Z1 devices. And with frame generation, again, if you can deal with the added input latency and some of the ghosting and stuff that can happen, they're getting pretty good with frame generation, especially in-game frame gen, and I think they did pretty well here on the ROG Ally. So you can see here 38, 39, whatever, 40, not a big difference between the 20 and the 30 watt there, but frame generation gains you about 20 FPS there. Alright, so taking a quick look at the Legion Go, very similar here, 20, 30, and 20 watts with frame gen, and you'll see a little bit of performance boost. Again, like this intensive scene gets a little bit more boost from being 30 watts, I feel like, than the Ally did at 20 versus 30, but either way, not a huge difference once things settle in, and then of course frame gen gaining you that 20 FPS, sometimes here 30 FPS, as you can see here, not a huge difference between that 20 and 30 without frame gen up there, though it's solid, feels great to play, it's snappy. Frame gen gives you some 70 FPS in this area. Again, more input latency and other things with visual quality, but it is there, it does work well, and surprisingly with this in-game frame gen for the Ally and the Go here, frame times stay really nice and feel really good here, so it's not like a hiccup issue, or it doesn't seem to cause a lot of problems, and I did have VSync for that, which helped out as well. Now the MSI Claw, of course, the last one we'll take a look at here, unplugged, plugged in, and then unplugged with frame generation. And this poor device sure does suffer, especially unplugged. And it's not just this game, there's a lot of games where they just haven't quite figured out how to balance this thing out and get it to run correctly. It's just, I don't know if they will at this point or what's going to happen. Hopefully they do, but I just feel like there's a lot of work to be done here when it comes to this first generation, whatever, Ultra Core series that we're seeing here in the handhelds, and hopefully they'll be able to work on these. Hopefully the next generation will really smooth things out and won't need as much power to try to get the performance that we're wanting to see here. But yeah, unfortunately the Claw definitely needs some work overall, and with this game maybe more with the drivers and stuff as well, but it's not a great experience here either way. You would definitely have to lower some things down. Alright guys, that's pretty much going to do it. I hope you got something out of the comparison. All those devices compared to each other, plus compared to themselves at 1080p, medium, and checking out some frame generation there as well. The game is really ported well to PC. It's running great on my normal desktop PCs. It's running great on the Ally, the Go, and even on the Steam Deck. So yeah, it's a pretty clean port that seems to be running really well. It just is kind of suffering there on the MSI Claw, but there are a lot of games that are suffering there. All right, guys, thanks a lot for coming and check out the video. As always, I really appreciate it, and I'll see you in the next one.